The New York Times just dropped a story about Conor McGregor, performance-enhancing drugs, and a prominent sports doctor that confirms what a significant portion of the MMA community has believed for years, and the implications of what that story reveals go well beyond McGregor himself. Because this is not just a story about one fighter's physical transformation or one broken leg that required an unusual recovery process. This is a story about the relationship between the UFC, its drug testing infrastructure, and the most commercially valuable fighter the organization has ever produced. And when you trace that relationship through the specific sequence of events that the Times investigation reveals, what you arrive at is a conclusion that is uncomfortable for anyone who loves this sport. The UFC does not operate as a sanctioned athletic competition in the traditional sense. It operates as a television show about a sport. The punches are real. The athletes are real. The competition has genuine unpredictability. But the institutional framework that is supposed to guarantee a clean and fair playing field for every participant is not real, at least not for everyone equally. Let's go through exactly what the Times reported, because the specific details matter and the tendency in these conversations is to blur them into generality. According to two people with direct knowledge of the matter who spoke on condition of anonymity, McGregor took powerful banned drugs. He did so with the support of Dr. Neil ElAttrache, described as one of the most prominent sports physicians in the world. ElAttrache, according to the report, sent McGregor to specialists in bone healing after repairing his broken leg, and then wrote a letter supporting McGregor's application for a special exemption, a TUE, or therapeutic use exemption, that would have allowed McGregor to take banned substances without penalty. ElAttrache himself responded by text to say that he does not prescribe hormone or steroid treatment, and that he referred McGregor to specialists after the surgery. Whether the letter he wrote was in support of the exemption application or something else is a distinction that the text of the response does not fully clarify. What the Times is reporting, based on direct sources, is that McGregor took the banned drugs and that he engaged in an active effort to evade scrutiny from anti-doping officials. Both of those things, if accurate, represent serious violations of the rules that are supposed to govern professional mixed martial arts competition. Now here is where the story gets structurally important rather than just personally interesting. The question is not really whether Conor McGregor used performance-enhancing drugs. His physical transformation during his time away from competition, from the featherweight frame that knocked out Jose Aldo in 13 seconds to the near 200-pound physique that showed up for the Roadhouse movie, has been the subject of open, documented speculation by people including Joe Rogan, who has discussed it on the most listened-to podcast in the world. The question that actually matters for the sport's integrity is what the UFC did when confronted with the situation. And what they did is documented in the official statement that USADA released when the two organizations ended their 8-year partnership. USADA's statement made clear that their relationship with the UFC ended in dispute over Conor McGregor specifically. After McGregor's leg break in July 2021, he was removed from the testing pool. USADA required that any fighter returning from a period outside the testing pool must be in the pool for 6 months and return 2 negative tests before being cleared to compete. This is a standard requirement that exists to prevent exactly the kind of scenario where an athlete uses banned substances during an injury absence and then returns to competition before those substances have cleared their system. USADA confirmed that McGregor entered the testing pool in October 2023 and stated clearly that there would be no exception given by the UFC for Conor to fight until he had met those requirements. And then, in what the USADA statement describes as a complete reversal of a previously positive relationship, the UFC ended the partnership and announced they were going in a different direction with Drug Free Sport International as their new testing partner. USADA's CEO Travis Tigert reportedly lost his composure on the phone when informed of the decision. The UFC's own Hunter Campbell, a man whose appearances behind a microphone are rare enough that his presence at a press conference signals genuine institutional alarm, held a public briefing to call USADA's statement a misrepresentation and to say that what they had done to McGregor was disgusting and potentially legally liable. Read that sequence in full and the conclusion is not subtle. The UFC ended its relationship with the most credible independent anti-doping agency available to the sport because that agency would not create an exception for Conor McGregor. The UFC replaced USADA with a different organization that operates under the UFC's institutional umbrella rather than independently of it. And Conor McGregor has since tested 12 times in the current year according to the UFC's own anti-doping portal, with all results returned as negative. He is, on paper, the most tested fighter on the roster. The issue with those 12 negative tests is something that most people outside of sports science circles do not fully understand, and it is documented in peer-reviewed research. A 2013 publication from Norwegian scientists, which got significant coverage in the BBC and elsewhere, documented what is now referred to as muscle memory in the context of performance-enhancing drug use, specifically the finding that athletes who have used banned substances can retain meaningful physical benefits for up to a decade after they stop using. The mechanism involves the persistence of additional myonuclei in muscle tissue, structural cellular changes that remain even after the drug-induced hormonal elevation has returned to baseline levels. What this means practically is that an athlete who used powerful anabolic substances during a multi-year rehabilitation period can pass every drug test administered after stopping use while still retaining a significant percentage of the physical advantages those substances produce. The tests measure current substance levels, not structural physiological changes from past use, and those structural changes, according to the research, persist. Apply that framework to Conor McGregor returning to competition against Max Holloway at 170 pounds. Holloway is a natural featherweight who has spent his career competing at 145 and occasionally 155. He is not walking into the cage at 170 pounds with a natural size and strength advantage over his opponent. McGregor, who was admitted by his own team to have been walking around at close to 200 pounds during his time away, is returning to competition after a multi-year period during which, according to sources with direct knowledge cited by the New York Times, he used powerful banned drugs to facilitate his recovery. The question of whether he currently has performance-enhancing substances in his system is, for the reasons just described, largely orthogonal to the question of whether he carries physical advantages derived from past use. A man who rebuilt his muscle mass and connective tissue using pharmaceutical assistance during a period when he was not being tested, and who then passed 12 tests after the fact, is not physiologically equivalent to an athlete who made the same physical changes without that assistance. The tests confirm the absence of the substance. They do not undo the structural adaptation. This is not primarily an argument about the McGregor versus Holloway matchup. It is an argument about institutional honesty. When USADA's CEO says clearly and publicly that the UFC ended their relationship because the UFC wanted an exception made for Conor McGregor that USADA would not sanction, and when that statement is met with a press conference from the UFC's general counsel calling it a misrepresentation and threatening legal action, and when the UFC then replaces USADA with an organization that reports to the UFC rather than operating independently of it, the picture that forms is not one of a sports organization that is committed to the integrity of its competitive product. It is one of a promotional organization that is committed to protecting the commercial value of its most important asset. The historical precedent for this kind of institutional accommodation is not limited to McGregor. The same testing system has been the subject of documented questions about other high-profile fighters. John Jones, whose positive test results have produced a years-long procedural saga, has had major events relocated to accommodate his legal situation. Brock Lesnar's return to UFC from professional wrestling raised similar questions about testing windows and exemptions. The 2017 investigation that revealed undisclosed exemptions from the standard 6-month testing requirement, the investigation whose documentation was actively removed from the Bloody Elbow archives after that publication was acquired by a UFC subsidiary, pointed to a systemic pattern rather than an isolated incident. The pattern is that the promotional needs of the organization and the competitive integrity requirements of a genuine sport are in structural tension, and when those two things conflict, the promotional needs have consistently prevailed. The larger argument here, the one that matters for how every fight on every card is understood going forward, is about the nature of the institution itself. A genuine athletic competition applies its rules uniformly across all participants because the legitimacy of every result depends on every participant operating under the same constraints. When rules are applied differently based on commercial importance, the results cannot be understood as purely competitive outcomes. They are outcomes within a system that has variable standards. And variable standards, by definition, are not the standards of a sport. They are the standards of a production. None of this makes the fights less real in terms of the violence and the physical competition. What happens inside the octagon is genuine. The athletes are genuine. The training is genuine. The skill differential that determines most outcomes is genuine. But the framework within which those genuine physical contests occur, the testing regime, the rule enforcement, the organizational decisions about who gets exceptions and who does not, is something different from what the promotional language describes. The UFC markets itself as the world's premier MMA organization with the highest standards of competition. What the USADA split, the New York Times investigation, and the documented history of testing exemptions reveal is that the standards are the highest available for most athletes and negotiable for the ones the organization cannot afford to lose. Conor McGregor is returning to fight Max Holloway at UFC 329 at 170 pounds. He has passed 12 tests. He is legally cleared to compete. And the physical advantages that the New York Times investigation says he derived from banned drug use during his rehabilitation, advantages that scientific research suggests can persist for years after the drug use itself has ended, are not something any test currently administered can detect or reverse. Whether that matters for the outcome of the fight is a question that will be answered inside the cage. Whether it matters for how we understand the institution that sanctions the fight is a question that the documentation already answers.